Hello, happy May 11th. It is the day before my 43rd birthday, which is so crazy. My name's Cassandra, and I'm the host of the Love Brought You Here podcast. Thank you for joining again. I never thought that I would make it to 30 years old, and here I am turning 43 tomorrow. I'm grateful, and also my mind is just completely blown by it. Thank you for joining me again today. I am, as I've said many times, I've gained access to an actual studio, but I do have to do some training to be able to use it. And there's also a protocol to wait. And so that will be at the beginning of June. I have a couple of guests booked for the show that I'm really excited about. One I did a show with my last podcast. I interviewed this person and I'm very excited to be reunited. It's just everything takes some time. And you might ask, why are you putting out these ridiculous episodes in the interim? But the answer is, and I think a lot of people probably who are creative minded struggle with this. I am a perfectionist. It turns out that I am good at just making things off the cuff, whatever it is. But I become so obsessed with making it perfect every time that sometimes I just have to create and be consistent with that. And I think that there's a lot to be said for allowing ourselves as humans to make mistakes, because mistakes are actually opportunities for us to grow. I realize that for myself personally, I spent a life being good at a lot of things. And once it started to be a struggle, I'd just move on to the next thing. I was never allowing myself the opportunity to truly grow and to truly polish any sort of skills. And so that is why you had the first installment of Hall or Hogwash last week. Let me know what you thought about that. Probably pretty weird. This week, we're going to change the pace just a little bit I've been thinking a lot about a specific topic, and it actually relates to this creative process that I've introduced you to this episode with. You'll hear about it as I'm actually going to read to you something that I wrote recently, a piece of just a prose, some thoughts that I wrote. And, there's a term called glass child, which will actually be defined as I read. But as a glass child, there was such an impact on me about being perfect all the time because I saw mistakes as disruptions. And so if you struggle with anything like that, I want to encourage you, make junk. Allow yourself to make junk, because sometimes that's what you need to do. Sometimes that will spawn an idea that could be your most fabulous idea that you've ever had. And we'll get into that directly, but first, I'm not sure what that means. First, I want to do the snack haul as always. My snack is actually in my water bottle today. It is a cold brew tea, and I don't know if you knew this. Any tea can be a cold brew tea. Who knew? But this is actually cold brew, so it's like fast. But this is a lychee and mango tea. It is absolutely delicious and delightful. Two of my favorite things ever. So, let's get into this. I think that even if you don't identify as a glass child, which again will be defined while I read, I think that you'll be able to see yourself in this. And I'm going to pose some questions before I start reading. And that is, are you someone who's struggling to find your voice, who struggles to stand up when it feels scary, to say the words, to use the words? Are you someone who's struggling to find your personal power? Or maybe you don't realize the ways that you're actually giving it away by not using your voice. All right, and here we go. The first time I learned that there were consequences for using my voice, specifically against abuse, I was 3 years old. My only sister, named Damaris, had profound disabilities, both physically and intellectually, and had to have all of her needs met by someone else, such as being fed, toileted, etc. Our mother was intentionally made to be unalived, because I can't say the word here, when I was 9 years old. And until the end of her life, when she became so sick that she couldn't care for herself any longer, I only remember one time that she had help caregiving for my sister and I. And this was when I was 3 years old and my sister was 9. For reasons that I don't remember, my mom hired a caregiver to come in and to offer respite while she did little tasks like go out and buy groceries without pulling us around. But after only one day, her plans were unfortunately derailed. While she was out very briefly, the caregiver was left with my sister and me, and she was feeding Damaris, and she couldn't get her to sit up to her liking. I watched as this caregiver stood behind my sister, grabbed her bangs, and pulled her head up by her bangs. And that evening, I told my mother. My mom never questioned what I told her, and at most met what I said with curiosity just to make sure that she fully comprehended, but she never questioned me. And the next day, she fired the caregiver. But before this woman left in protest, she said to my mother, "You're going to believe this crazy child over me, an adult." Once again, my mother didn't hesitate. She didn't blink, and she told the woman to leave. However, I heard what she said. My little 3-year-old self felt the emotional implications of being called crazy for the first time, even though I had merely said out loud what I had witnessed. And somewhere in my already parentified heart, I understood that speaking up came at a cost, even with an amazing support system like my mother. But I knew that my words and my truth, despite their origin or the fact that they were rooted in justice, had just cost my mom the only relief she had ever gotten, even if she didn't say that or show that to me in any way. And that was the moment when I learned to accept being silenced if the exchange meant perceived physical comfort, not only for myself, but for those without a voice like Damaris or those who I loved, like my mother. There's a term called glass child that's used to describe the sibling of a child who has some type of exceptional needs, like my sister Damaris. It refers to the fact that the child without the disabilities or the extra needs grows up feeling see-through, like glass. It's usually not a conscious wound that's carried with any sort of resentment, because most of us who are glass children grow up with empathy that far exceeds those of quote-unquote normal family dynamics. Most of us understand what a privilege and an honor it is to be loved and trusted by someone so vulnerable and special like our sibling. But more than one thing can be true at the same time. The wound isn't just from being overlooked because the quote-unquote normal child doesn't have a disability. Often these children, like myself, are high achievers who don't cause problems. They're the kids who everyone says are such a joy to be around and are never an issue. But the shadow of this is that this is very much a learned behavior. Though these children are often quiet, they are also some of the most sensitive to nonverbal cues. Often, they've learned some sort of adaptive communication used to interact with their siblings, and therefore become able to read other forms of nonverbal communication very quickly. The family units, even under the best and most well-intentioned circumstances, tend to be rather unpredictable for a child who is developing their personality and their psyche. Things like bathroom accidents with their siblings or uncontrolled and unregulated emotions due to a simple lack of understanding or health emergencies happen in these households on frequent, almost daily basis. And more often than not, plans are simply something that can rarely be executed. So, these glass children learn to be quiet and small with their needs and to not add to the uncertainty of their household. They learn that if they avoid adding to the emotional or logistical chaos of the family unit, maybe things will go more smoothly. Maybe people can be happy. And so their actions become very strategic, measured, and planned. And not just regularly planned, but they'll have solutions for 20 different scenarios before any issues are even thought of, or have an opportunity to arise. Now, this is also common in families where there is an abusive dynamic. You do see this, but I would argue that it manifests a little bit differently in the lives of glass children because these kids aren't just protecting themselves. They are also protecting their siblings, who often don't have a direct form of verbal communication. They're voiceless sometimes. While there's something to be said of learning diplomacy and when to speak up and when to not, there's another way that these children experience life differently. They don't just learn to silence themselves and their own needs and sacrifice for a sibling. They also learn to minimize their own accomplishments, because more often than not, any kind of external attention to the family unit can disrupt the already teetering sense of normalcy that these children crave and need to develop and to learn about themselves. Even when a glass child is exceptionally gifted, and they often are, intellectually, physically, emotionally, they learn to exist within mediocrity. They become chameleons in a myriad of group dynamics and often learn to desperately cling to anything that feels like physical stability, even if it comes at the cost of their self-expression or their voice. Even if it comes at the cost of being seen for their positive attributes. And in cases like mine, when you have unthinkable abuse layered on top of these dynamics that are already complicated, these children become adults who are overly adaptable and who are uncomfortable standing out in a crowd, for good or for bad. It's not that we resent our siblings. In fact, most of us feel that it is such a blessing to have a sibling with special needs. It's not that our parents were wrong for being subconsciously accepting of the relief that having at least one kid that needed a little less than the one that demanded every ounce of their energy. But what you do see is the natural progression of a child who becomes an adult that is so accepting of being see-through that they even fade into their own backgrounds. They don't realize that they never even saw or knew themselves. And as they find their voices, if they ever find their voices, they tend to try to use them for others, not understanding that at their core, speaking for themselves is what gives them a voice for the voiceless. And this is my story of origin. It's not about the overt abuse that my family endured at the hands of my father, although that is certainly a large part of it. It is a piece that I can't deny. But instead, the foundation of my story really starts with an adoring mother and a sister that I loved deeply and with whom I had a relationship that transcended anything that I could ever articulate. The origin of learning to be comfortable with my own silence has less to do with the abuse of power dynamics and more to do with the natural progression of the parts of my family that was loving and nurturing, at least for the first 9 years of my life. It has to do with my mother and my sister and the beauty that they surrounded me with. My origin story is less about the obvious things that went wrong and more about the things that lie within the subtleties and even beauty. And when I learned to speak against abusive dynamics as nearly a middle-aged adult, I began to do so without being able to comprehend that I wasn't impassioned by the abuse of power itself, but more so by the fact that I never belonged in those group dynamics that I was fighting in the first place. I was never wrong to speak up for myself. I wasn't wrong about the abuse of power and the patterns that I saw that were missed and dismissed by others and by institutions. But my voice was misunderstood and misrepresented, often intentionally, because I thought I was speaking for myself and on behalf of those who lacked a voice. But I was actually taking a stand for people who just weren't willing to even speak up for themselves. While you can set the table for someone, you can't force them to eat. And many people choose never to eat. I realize now I was constantly looking for my sister's face because I didn't understand that we were separate. And I was yearning for the same unquestioning acceptance that my mother had given me when I spoke truthfully and with conviction. But the rooms in which I was speaking contained people interested in maintaining the status quo and peace, dedicated to it even. No amount of using the right words or presenting the right research or flexing my intellect could make these people or these institutions see me, although I tried. Because in reality, I was still speaking from a place of being a glass child and from being see-through. If I had comprehended that my mother, even in her absence, always supported my endeavors to stand up for myself, I wouldn't have kept fighting institutions designed to resist improvement, because I would have known that I only needed my own approval. If I knew the gift that lies within seeing the subtleties that most miss, whether intentionally or obliviously, I would have walked away with my dignity intact more often. If I had understood that my voice was Cassandra's voice and not Damaris's voice, I would have understood the importance of leaving places that were supportive of harmful hierarchies that I felt so impassioned to stay and dig my heels in and fight. But as a glass child, it took me over 40 years to understand that my voice was my own, and that safety was never cultivated in environments that required me to be silenced, nor that required me to exhaust my voice in protest. It took me over 40 years to understand that when I used the voice of Cassandra for Cassandra, I was choosing to love myself. And in doing so, I wasn't abandoning Damaris, but I was instead freeing us both. My sister Damaris would never have wanted us to both be bound by a single voice. She wouldn't have wanted us to be held captive because of my survivor's guilt that feared if I spoke for myself and didn't include her or someone else, I was somehow leaving her behind. She wouldn't have encouraged the continuation of my subconscious fear that if I spoke to free myself, I risked abandoning her. If her message was able to be carried by audible words, she would have told me that freeing myself was ultimately freeing a piece of her that had always been bound in silence, and that choosing myself wasn't turning my back on her, but was instead choosing us both. She would have told me to move around the world fearlessly for us both and have the experiences that she couldn't, and to say the things and use the words to free myself. In February of 2022, I was barely alive, mentally, emotionally, and very literally physically, as a result of a type of domestic violence that is rare and bizarre and is usually female-led. I was in a same-sex marriage that nearly ended my life. And during this period of time, my mind had finally begun to follow the path that my body had been experiencing for the duration of my relationship, and it had begun shutting down. I could no longer form cohesive sentences or even put words together in meaningful ways until one day, in what I believe to be my spirit's last attempt to avoid being extinguished, I wrote the following short story. I was so sick I didn't even remember writing it until months later. But I know that this short piece of prose was a resistance to disappearing. It was a comprehensive understanding that safety and stability is permanent and real only when it is not exchanged for someone's truth or for their voice. What came from the depths of my soul on this day in February of 2022 is an illustration of the fact that our emotional safety exists symbolically in the choices we make for ourselves in the physical world. And to read this story that I wrote to free myself using my voice for me, Cassandra, to read this is someone who hadn't quite found her voice yet. It's me from February of 2023, exactly 1 year after I wrote this piece. Formerly, I had it titled as The Growth of the Glass Child, but I now call it The Cassandra Voice. You'll see that I look very different in this video. My hair is growing back because my head had been shaved because I had been too sick to care for myself, among other things. You can hear that I speak differently. Even though I had been a content creator for a few months at this point, I was still very unsure of myself. And I can hear the distrust of myself. But I wanted her to read it because I thought, who better to read it, and so that you can see the adaptation and the growth. So this is the Cassandra Voice, and if you want to see the video more clearly, because I am going to have to hold it up to the microphone, you're welcome to please check out my Instagram page. You can either check out Love Brought You Here podcast, and then my other account is the Cassandra Voice. It's the_Cassandra_voice. I will link my link tree with all of that information for you in this episode or in the show. So here I give you, again, it used to be called The Growth of a Glass Child, but now I'm calling it the Cassandra Voice. Just kidding. I think that my earbuds accidentally... Well, I don't know where my sound went. Let's see. Bear with me for just a moment. Got it.
I think the moment that I felt like I had really made it was in my mid-20s when I got my own apartment. But it wasn't living in my own apartment that swelled my mind with visions of independence and importance. It was my Dollar General coffee table that I bought for $20. It was made of plastic and particle board and fashioned to look like different types of wood. It was a terrible table, if I'm being honest. But I chose it, I paid for it, assembled it, and most importantly, I filled my space with it. My space. Less important was the fact that I didn't have a roommate for the first time ever. I genuinely enjoyed living with others and learning how to cohabitate. I've always been a sucker for learning about social human interactions and behaviors, so roommates proved as free windows into that world. But that didn't matter so much. The coffee table was my trophy. It was a statue of sorts that represented complete choice in the way that I dealt with my own space and even with myself. That cheap plastic coffee table spoke to me in the soft voice of the sun gently healing a broken plant, applying gentle but consistent warmth to the area needing attention. In this case, I was the plant, and the broken limb was my lack of prior opportunities to fully embrace and acknowledge my own desires and even attention to basic human needs. For the first time in my life, I was allowed to have a coffee table because I didn't need to worry about my physically disabled sister tripping over it. I had always wanted a coffee table as a child for some reason, but was regularly and ultimately met with complete disagreement from my father. My sister could get hurt, and that was more important than any needs or thoughts that I might have on decorating. So, as time went on, as I was a child, I missed out on many coffee tables. I had learned to accept that some people just don't get to have coffee tables, and that's that. I learned to silence my own thoughts, feelings, and desires because they obviously weren't worth discussing. But as I assembled and began setting up that coffee table in my very own apartment, this glass child felt seen for the first time. I felt more like stained glass and a little less translucent.
And I left that unedited because I know that I didn't understand the gravity of what I was writing and the symbolism of what I was writing when it came out, when I was grasping onto life. And it all came down to that situation that I was in with my ex-wife, was because I didn't use my voice. I didn't believe in myself that there was another way. I truly believed that she needed to be in charge of me because I didn't know what I was doing and couldn't make decisions for myself. So I encourage you, did you see a part of yourself in this episode? Even if you're not a glass child, did you see yourself reflected? Did this make you think? What are some ways that you have been not using your voice and therefore giving away your personal power? Because often it is subtle. Often, like I identified, it is in the subtleties and sometimes the beauty and the things that feel good, the things that feel like comfort and safety. Those are the places that are actually more impactful than the overt and glaring nature of different types of abuse that we've endured. You know, love looks very different. Love shapeshifts just as much as other things do. But love is pure and it is consistent. And I think that the great thing about it is love is like that light. I believe that darkness and light have to both exist. Because how can you know how far your own light will shine if you've never seen the depth of your own darkness? But I think that love and learning self-love is the thing that pierces that darkness and that will pull you out and that will illuminate everything, will illuminate the places where you've been giving away your power. So write a story, write a song, paint a picture, I don't know, crochet something. Find your voice. Find a way to express yourself and your stories. Find a way to process that. And don't forget to check out my Substack and my Snacks and Tracks playlist on YouTube, where I'm adding the song Cassandra, appropriately, by Florence and the Machine. If you don't know about the meaning of the word Cassandra, it is actually from Greek mythology, and I will put that in my Substack. That probably won't be up until Tuesday. I was actually sick this week, so that's why everything's a little late. And lastly, if you're here, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you're getting something from this even as I'm trying to find my own voice within this show and trying to get my guests and get everything up and fully running. Thank you for growing with me and learning with me through my mistakes. But always remember, in the words of James Baldwin, love brought you here. If you've trusted love this far, don't panic now. I'm Cassandra, and this is the Love Brought You Here podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me, and I will see you next week.